I'm meeting today with Glenn Wharton, who is art conservator and professor with a background in archaeological sculpture and time-based media conservation. He's currently a professor of art history and a professor for conservation of material culture at UCLA. He's also the chair of the UCLA Getty program in the conservation of archaeological and ethnographic materials. Prior to his engagement with UCLA, Glenn was on faculty in the Museum Studies program at New York University and was practicing time-based conservator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He established a non-profit platform, Voices in Contemporary Art, and have sat on numerous boards and committees whose concerns relates to the domain of conservation. Glenn has a long list of grants and awards, which I won't be able to enumerate now. But what I would like to emphasize is that his writings and lectures have inspired innumerable theorists and practitioners of conservation and are an invaluable source of knowledge and wisdom. Glenn, thank you so much for making time for our conversation. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? No? And if not, why? And the second question, what does it mean to conserve performance?
Well, I'll start with the first. Thank you for that introduction, by the way. It was a little overwhelming, but I'll try to live up to what you said my past has been. My short answer is yes, performance can be conserved. And I say this based on my work at MoMA. Over the past 15 years or so, artists have been producing performance works in series for consumption by collectors and collecting institutions, and conservators and their colleagues have responded. So I remember at MoMA, when we first acquired Roman Ondaat's Measuring the Universe in 2007, we were all scratching our heads like, well, what does it mean to acquire the rights to reperform a performance work? And what do we do? How do we create the conditions for perpetuating this work in the future? And these works, once owned by the museum, are meant to be reinterpreted by new performers, and to some extent, as defined by the artist, altered by the museum and by new performers. But in a way, it was for the answer to our question of how to conserve these performance works that we were acquiring was rather simple. We were already doing artist interviews. So we interviewed the artist. What is the work? Could you describe it? Who can perform it? How are people trained? Where can it be performed? What are the environmental conditions? What should people wear? What should their training be? How should they interact with the audience, the public? So we would perform these interviews, and then we might create a video of the artist performing the work, and the artist training someone else to perform the work, and then someone else performing the work, and maybe artist interaction or audience interactions. So we built the kind of documentation that we were already building for installation art, time-based media works. So in a way, it was a very easy transition. We already had questionnaires for video, audio, software works for artists. So we created a questionnaire for performance artists. We gathered floor plans and we created manuals that described the work and describe the specifications for environmental characteristics, and answering the questions that I just rattled off: who can perform the work, what's the selection and training process, and so on, including signage, what should the public know about the work in advance, how should security staff interact with the work. So all the logistics of performance, including contracts. So what were the agreements between the institution and the artist or the artist studio? One thing that came up quite frequently was many of the artists wanted to be flown out every time the work was reperformed so that they could either perform the works themselves or train someone else to perform the work. And we fought back a little bit, saying, well, we don't have the kind of funding to bring you or your representatives out in perpetuity, but maybe over 3 times or 5 times, we will gain the institutional capacity to do the selection and training for reperformance. So all of those logistics were pretty straightforward, to be honest. I mean, in fact, it was simpler than software art and some of the more complicated technical works that we were also addressing. But clearly there are larger questions at stake. And we all go back to Peggy Phelan's 1993 book, Unmarked: The Politics of Performance, and her argument that performance is not reproducible. It's time and place specific. So we were collecting works that were intended to be reperformed. We weren't collecting happenings from the 60s or some of the kinds of works that were had been created before in a very different, sometimes anti-institutional context. So just in terms of conserving those kinds of works that were created in series for selling, I would say absolutely they were intended to be conserved and they can be conserved. But in thinking about the larger questions of authenticity, fortunately, we now have over a couple of decades of conservation discourse and literature that expanded how we think about authenticity for works that change over time and place. And one could argue that all art, all cultural heritage changes over time and place, but this is a form of art that it is intended to and does so quite radically. So this literature borrows heavily from philosophy and social sciences and performing arts theory to help us understand maybe the work-defining properties that we have to characterize to transmit the works into the future. We now talk about autographic and allographic characteristics of performances and installation works in order to help us define these work-defining properties. The literature now defines authenticity as being in flux, that it's never the same in different times and places. It's never understood the same by different people or groups of people. And as you've argued in your own writing, we need to rethink time and linear time in Western philosophy just doesn't work for performances that can only be known through their past, present, and future. So your writing has really influenced the way I think about what the work is, that it just needs to be constituted or understood in a very different construction of time. And that the documentation that we are building and other people are building allows us to understand performances in multiple dimensions. So I've sort of answered that. I tried to answer it in a logistical way that yes, and this is how we do it, but in a more theoretical way that these are some of the issues that come up and have to be addressed and understood. And they're all very case specific. So each work we need to approach in a different way and come to different practices.
So what does it mean to conserve performance?
I'd like to answer this through the context of what I am working on right now. As you mentioned at the beginning, I left MoMA and left New York to come to Los Angeles to be in the art history department, but also chair of this UCLA Getty conservation program for cultural heritage conservation. And so in some of the research that I'm just beginning, I'm looking at the resonance between emerging theory and practice in contemporary art and emerging theory and practice in traditional cultural heritage to try to identify areas where they can learn from each other and what is happening in parallel and what is specific maybe to contemporary art that doesn't work for traditional cultural heritage. I'm finding more similarities than differences, interestingly enough. For instance, I think it will help us if we think about contemporary performance works as intangible heritage. In 2003, UNESCO produced a convention for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage or living heritage, which includes song, music, dance, drama, skills, and crafts that are transmitted from one generation to another. If we think about that, that's not so different from transmitting performance art from one generation to the other. In fact, what is the difference? I'm not seeing a lot, especially if we look at indigenous cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage, and how that is transmitted. I mean, the multiple ways in which it's transmitted. And I think looking at these traditional forms of transmission will be very helpful as we theorize and just practice the conservation of performance art. Couple of other areas where I see resonance is that conservators of traditional intangible cultural heritage are shifting their role to be collaborators or to be to step back and allow indigenous systems of care to take the forefront. And at times conservators are working to create the conditions to continue cultural traditions rather than doing that work themselves. And if we look at contemporary art, that might mean the same. The conservators are, yes, trying to understand what the performance is, but they're working with artists, with the public, with performers to allow the work to be transmitted, to be reperformed, and finding value not in getting it right in terms of an exact simulation, but in finding value in public experience of the work. And with traditional cultural heritage, that might mean in spiritual or ritual or cultural practices, building personal memory and collective memory. And I think that transmits quite easily to performance art and a lot of what artists say about their work and why they're doing it. So I think if we sort of look at what's going on in other areas of conservation, we can learn a lot. We're now thinking, we as a field, I think quite generally, it's that conservation, which had been framed as a science, still uses scientific methodology to great value, but we're understanding the field as subjective and that everything is subjective, and it's not neutral. So, we're looking at power dynamics and systemic racism in conserving traditional cultural heritage, and allowing, practices to sort of break through and give other people voices in the conservation process. So again, this would mean that museum professionals need to step back and forefront artists and what it is that they are really trying to do. So this leads to a practice that allows the artists and the people who experience the work to weigh in on deciding what the work has been, is, and can be in the future. So this is where my mind is going. When you ask, what does it mean to conserve performance? To me, it means rethinking the role of conservation and bringing in lessons from other areas of conservation in order for this, what I would call intangible cultural heritage, to be transmitted to the future.